Thank you for writing this really great piece at Mondo Weiss. How the UN could act today to stop the genocide in Palestine. So walk people through how the UN could do this and what this little used UN mechanism is.
Yeah, right. So I think everybody is aware by now that essentially all international institutions have failed utterly to take the action that would be necessary to put an end to this 23 months of live stream genocide that we've been witnessing in Palestine. And it's normal that folks are saying, you know, what happened to all these international laws, all these international institutions, everything that was supposed to be built up since the Second World War to say never again and to actually intervene? What happened to the responsibility to protect? What happened to international human rights? And they're right to ask that question. The problem is people often don't dig much deeper than that. And so the quick answer is, well, the US, which is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, which is the only enforcement body in the international system, vetoes every attempt to do something meaningful, and therefore there's nothing that can be done. The first half of that is true. The US, as a co-perpetrator of the genocide and as a permanent member, continuously uses its veto in order to make sure that the genocide continues. But there are a lot of countries out there that like to hide behind that veto, right? They like to say, well, we tried, but the US vetoed it. There's nothing we can do. And what my piece says is there is something they can do. There are a few things that they could do. One is that the obligations that they have under existing human rights treaties actually oblige them to take action to intervene if they're in a position to do so, to help to stop the genocide, to break the siege, to bring in humanitarian aid, to protect civilians, and so on. So, for example, the Geneva Conventions are treaties that not only force countries to respect the rules that are in the Geneva Conventions, but they're also obliged to, quote, ensure respect, which means they have to take action when other countries are violating them to step in. None have done that. The same is true of the Genocide Convention and of other international instruments. So any country or group of countries at this moment or any time in the past 2 years could have acted within certain parameters to try to do something. Now, with the exception of, Ansar Allah, Yemen, no country has done so in a meaningful way. You can argue that there were diplomatic and legal measures taken, South Africa's landmark genocide case in the World Court and so on, but none have actually deployed their navies or their armies or their logistical capacities. And that's because countries really like to have diplomatic, legal cover. They like to have an international mandate to take action. And when they see that the Security Council won't give it to them, they just throw up their arms. But there is another mechanism, Katie. It's called Uniting for Peace, which is the name of a resolution that was adopted in the General Assembly in 1950 at the height of the Cold War that allows countries to circumvent a veto in the Security Council and to take practical action on the ground. Now, that resolution, Uniting for Peace, has been used many times, but it's even been used several times during the current upsurge in genocide in Gaza. But it's been used for the most part only to make some general calls for a ceasefire, for humanitarian aid, and so on, but no practical measures have been adopted. And there is a precedent here that could be applied under Uniting for Peace with a modicum of political will. And this is what it is. In 1956, the British and the French and the Israelis were attacking the Sinai. And, oddly, the US was opposed to that intervention. Folks will forget. But of course, the British and the French were not going to allow action to stop it in the Security Council because they too have vetoes. And so what happened was this resolution was adopted with a supermajority in the General Assembly that said, when the Security Council can't act, the General Assembly, which is a democratic body where every state has one vote, 193 countries, there's no veto, the General Assembly can act in place of the Security Council with enhanced powers, not the same powers as the Security Council, there are limitations, but with enhanced powers. And what they did in 1956 was they mandated a UN emergency force called UNEF, the UN Emergency Force, and actually deployed troops to the Sinai. And they did that because they got a 2/3 majority, which is required for this mechanism, in the General Assembly, and then got countries to, beginning with the Canadians, to provide forces to actually launch this intervention. They didn't need so-called Chapter 7, which is the enforcement power of the Security Council, because they got the consent of Egypt to deploy their troops to the Sinai. Now, in Palestine, we have a very clear case, a very clear opportunity to do the same thing, because just last year in 2024, the International Court of Justice made very clear that Israel has no sovereignty over Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, that it has no authority in those territories, it has no rights in those territories, not even to say yes or no. It doesn't have any legal standing to pronounce on whether or not a force should be deployed. The only entity that would have legal standing would be the state of Palestine, as represented by the Observer Mission of Palestine to the UN, which has itself requested intervention already. What that means, in a nutshell, is that because Palestine has requested it, because Israel has no rights in the territories to say yes or no, because there is the 1956 precedent, and because the General Assembly has the power to do it under the Uniting for Peace resolution, the UN today could deploy a UN protection force to Palestine with a specific mandate to protect civilians, to deliver humanitarian aid, to preserve evidence of Israeli war crimes, and to begin the process of recovery and reconstruction. And there's nothing legally that Israel could say. Now, I'm going to stop, but I first want to say, of course, it is politically challenging, because you can be sure that the United States and the Israelis, and maybe some of their other complicit allies, will do everything in their power to block the resolution by threats and bribery to small countries so that they don't vote in favor of it, and potentially to obstruct the mission. But there have been a number of resolutions on Palestine where a supermajority has been gained, more than 2/3 of the General Assembly. There's no reason to believe that you couldn't achieve it now. And the beauty of this is that every country effectively, under the glare of public scrutiny, would have to vote yes or no for a protection force for a people that's undergoing genocide. They wouldn't be able to hide behind the US veto or the dark corridors of Turtle Bay at the UN. They would be forced to say on the record that they support it or they don't support it. And I think with that kind of political pressure, there's a decent chance, at least, that a resolution like that could be passed.
Okay, so walk us through what this would look like. What it would look like within the UN, and then what it would look like on the ground.
So in the UN, we've reached a particular moment here. You know, on roughly the 18th of September, a deadline is going to expire, which was given to Israel by the General Assembly a year ago, in which they said, you have to end the occupation, because the World Court has said you have to end the occupation entirely. And you have to implement the provisional orders of the World Court on the genocide case as well. If this is not all done, if you don't comply within 1 year, the 1 year is going to be up in a couple of weeks, then additional measures will be adopted. And in the UN, what's happening is that Israel's principally Western allies, as well as the Saudis and a few others, are scurrying to try to shift the focus away from Israeli accountability and away from resolutions, for example, in the General Assembly under Uniting for Peace, that could call for economic sanctions, a military embargo, the stripping of Israel of its UN General Assembly credentials, the reactivation of the anti-apartheid mechanisms, potentially the establishment of a criminal tribunal for Israel, and the mandating of a UN protection force for Palestine. What these countries that are working with Israel are trying to do is to shift it away and say, let's not do that. Let's focus everybody on a handful of states recognizing the state of Palestine and getting back into a kind of Oslo process, a kind of Oslo 2.0, a two-state solution. a Palestinian Bantustan somewhere down the road, but let's normalize Israel's status even as it perpetrates a genocide in Palestine. And that's the tug of war that's going on now in international diplomacy and in the UN. If people focused on justice, international law, accountability prevail, then you could have what I have been describing, all of those elements. If they don't, you will end up with basically measures that are designed to give Israel once again a cloak of normalization. So it comes up in the end to the political will of the majority of member states to stand on principle here. Now, as I said, the state of Palestine has already requested these measures, and in particular, the deploying of a UN protection force. It has been also called for by organized Palestinian civil society from organizations across Palestine, and their lead coordination mechanism called PNGO, has called for it. Many voices in Gaza have appealed, have begged for that kind of intervention. It has been supported by a coalition of civil society actors across borders and across the world. It's getting a lot of attention now. But the fact that it's getting a lot of attention is also increasing the pushback that's happening in the UN to prevent it from happening. If we get there, what will happen is, there are two possible channels. One is they first try to get it through the Security Council. The Americans veto it. That's one scenario. And then it goes to the General Assembly under Uniting for Peace, where it could pass, even though the US in particular would be mobilized to try to prevent it from passing, but it still could pass. There's another scenario where the French and the Americans enter into a scheme together, and they pass a watered down resolution in the Security Council to prevent these more meaningful things from happening in the General Assembly. And so the French and the Saudis have been pushing a so-called stabilization force. But if you look at the details of that stabilization force, you see it's not really focused on the protection of Palestinian civilians from the Israeli perpetrators, but it's more focused on trying to normalize the situation, to return to the status quo before October 2023, with the caging of the Palestinian people, to normalize Israel again in spite of its many crimes of the last 2 years. Hopefully, that will not be what comes out of this, but there's a very big push to make that be the story. And then, there's a third possibility, which it goes to the GA under Uniting for Peace, and the Americans and the Israelis manage to threaten, bribe. The Americans are not beyond threatening small countries that are struggling with sanctions, with tariffs, with God knows what. What will make the difference here is the degree to which there is a bright public light and a powerful public demand from civil society across the world to say, hold the line for Palestine. Don't miss this opportunity, because we've been watching all of these countries for 2 years standing idly by while this genocide carries on day after day, month after month.